The little black girl whispered to the biker that she heard her mom crying behind the utility walls at midnight. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. On a chilly autumn night, the sound of distant trains echoed through the city, carrying with it a faint sense of unease. It was well past midnight when a small figure emerged from the shadows. A little black girl, no older than 9, her face streaked with tears and dirt, ran barefoot down the quiet, deserted street. Her clothes were torn, and her heart raced with fear. She had no one to turn to but the group of bikers gathered at the local carnival booth. They had been there for the past few hours, running a charity stand, offering food and drinks to those who passed by. The smell of popcorn and sizzling burgers mixed with the night air, but to her, it felt suffocating. She could hardly catch her breath as she approached the booth, her hands trembling as she reached for the nearest biker. The man, a large figure in a worn leather jacket, looked down at her in surprise. His graying beard and weathered face softened as she clung to him, her words coming out in broken sobs. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rumbling engines of the bikes. "I heard my mom crying. She's behind the utility walls. Please help her." The biker, whose name was Jack, froze for a moment, taken aback by the urgency in her voice. His first instinct was to dismiss it as another wild story, a child's imagination running free. But something in her eyes told him otherwise. This was no fantasy. Something was terribly wrong. The other bikers around him glanced at one another, sensing the tension in the air. They had all ridden in from different parts of the state for a simple charity event, but now they were faced with a situation that didn't feel right. Jack bent down to the girl's level, his face hardening with determination. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "Behind the utility walls," the girl repeated, her voice cracking with fear. Jack's gaze sharpened. This wasn't just a cry for help. It was a direct plea for their intervention. He stood up, motioning for the other bikers to follow. They didn't ask questions. They didn't hesitate. The club's code was clear: protect the helpless, no matter the cost. As they followed the girl through the dark streets, Jack's mind raced. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of foreboding. He had seen enough of the world to know when something was off. The closer they got to the utility area, the more Jack's instincts screamed that they were walking into something dangerous. The girl led them down a narrow alley, its edges shrouded in darkness. She stopped in front of an old, decaying wall covered with vines. It looked like any other rundown part of town, forgotten, neglected, abandoned. But Jack knew better. This was where the girl's mother was hiding. As the group of bikers surveyed the area, Jack turned to the girl one last time. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice low but steady. "We'll take care of it." The girl nodded silently, clutching her hands tightly to her chest. Jack and his crew moved forward, the sound of their boots and the low hum of motorcycle engines fading into the night as they prepared to confront whatever awaited them behind those walls. The group of bikers, led by Jack, stood still in front of the utility wall, the atmosphere tense with anticipation. The girl, no older than 9, clutched her hands together tightly, her body shaking as she glanced at Jack, her big brown eyes filled with fear. Her voice had cracked when she spoke earlier, but now there was a deep silence that felt like the calm before a storm. Jack's instincts were on high alert. Every bone in his body screamed that something was terribly wrong, but he couldn't back down. Not now. Not when a little girl was depending on them. The wall in front of them was old, crumbling in some places, but Jack knew it was the source of the girl's desperation. The way she had spoken, the way she had pleaded with him, it was clear this was no ordinary rescue. Something dark lingered behind those walls. He motioned to the other bikers, who moved in with purpose. Diesel, the largest of the group, took the lead, his broad shoulders pushing through the alley as he inspected the area. "It's quiet," Diesel muttered, his deep voice carrying through the air. "Too quiet." "I know," Jack replied, his gaze scanning the surroundings. "But we move quickly. No time for hesitation." The rest of the crew, accustomed to dangerous situations, fell into a line behind Jack, each of them alert and ready. They had been through worse, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to uncover. As Jack walked toward the wall, his boots crunching on the gravel, he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edge of his vision, crept over him. He was no stranger to danger, but this felt different. There was a coldness in the air, a heaviness that made the night feel suffocating. They reached the wall, and Diesel, with his massive hands, pushed aside a rusted metal grate that covered a small gap between the bricks. The faint sound of muffled cries echoed from the darkness behind the wall. The girl's mother. Jack's heart skipped a beat. Without hesitation, he signaled the crew to follow. The sound grew louder as they stepped forward, the cries of a woman in distress. They rounded the corner, and there, lying on the cold, cracked floor of a small, dimly lit room, was the woman. She was thin, almost skeletal, her skin pale, and her eyes closed as if she were unconscious. But it was the bruising on her neck and arms that told the story. It was clear she had been beaten, and badly. The air smelled musty, stale, like something that had been left to rot. Jack's fists clenched at his sides. He had seen the effects of abuse before, but nothing like this. The woman's condition was worse than he had imagined. Is she alive? Vince, the club's medic, asked as he crouched next to the woman, his experienced hands already checking for signs of life. Jack didn't need to hear the answer to know the truth. The woman was barely clinging to life. She's still breathing, Vince said, his voice low. But she's in bad shape. We need to get her out of here. Jack nodded grimly. We'll take her with us. As the crew moved to carefully lift the woman, Diesel's voice cut through the silence. Jack, we've got company. Jack's head whipped around, his heart racing. He had known this moment would come. The sound of engines revving echoed from the alley behind them. Someone had heard them. Someone was coming. Let's move now, Jack barked. The bikers quickly loaded the woman onto one of the bikes, the girl still following closely behind, her face pale but determined. Jack's mind raced. They needed to get out of there before whoever was coming caught up to them. The sound of footsteps grew louder, but Jack and the crew were already revving their engines, ready to make their escape. As the crew sped away, Jack's thoughts raced. Who could have done this? Who would hurt a mother like that? And why? But there was no time for questions now. They had to get the woman to safety. The sound of their bikes roaring to life seemed to fill the night, cutting through the silence of the alley. Jack led the way, the girl riding behind him, clutching tightly to his jacket. They didn't look back. The chase was on. The rumble of the motorcycles echoed through the empty streets as Jack and his crew sped through the night, the harsh wind whipping against their faces. The woman, barely conscious, was secured tightly on the back of Diesel's bike, her fragile body leaning against him. The little girl, still clinging to Jack's leather jacket, looked up at him with wide eyes, her fear replaced by a flicker of hope. For the first time in hours, she seemed to believe that they were going to get her mother the help she needed. The group rode in tight formation, their engines roaring like thunder, creating a trail of dust behind them as they raced through the darkened streets. Jack's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but one question stood out above the rest. Who did this to her? Who would hurt a woman so badly, and why would they target her? As they approached the outskirts of the city, Jack noticed the flickering lights of Mercy General Hospital in the distance. It felt like a beacon, a symbol of safety, but he knew that they weren't out of danger. Yet, not by a long shot. The hospital was their goal, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following them. He glanced over his shoulder, his grip tightening on the handlebars, but the road behind them was empty. For now, they were safe. At least for the moment. We're almost there, Jack shouted over the roar of the engines. Everyone keep it tight. The bikers responded with a chorus of roars, their bikes rumbling like a well-oiled machine. They had been through a lot together, and tonight, they were united by one mission, to protect this little girl and her mother. As they neared the hospital, Jack saw the flashing lights of police cars in the parking lot, their red and blue lights cutting through the darkness. It wasn't just a random coincidence. Something was going down, and it didn't take much for Jack to figure out that they were walking into a potential storm. He knew they had to act fast. They couldn't afford to wait around for things to get complicated. Jack signaled for the bikers to stop, their engines fading into a low hum as they came to a halt in front of the hospital entrance. He quickly dismounted, helping the little girl off his bike. She was trembling, but she held onto his arm as they made their way toward the entrance. The hospital doors slid open as Jack approached, and immediately, the smell of antiseptic and faint hospital chatter filled the air. But it wasn't the usual sterile atmosphere of a hospital. There was an unsettling tension hanging in the air, a sense that something wasn't quite right. Jack's heart sank when he saw the two uniformed officers standing near the entrance, their eyes flicking toward him as he approached. "Can I help you?" one of the officers asked, his hand resting near his belt. Jack didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "I'm here to see Maya Jenkins. She's been hurt. Her stepfather." Jack paused for a moment, his jaw tightening. "He's the one who did this. We need to get her out of here. Now." The officer's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at the other officer, who was speaking into a radio. Jack could feel the pressure building in his chest. He could sense the officers weren't convinced, but he didn't have time to explain himself. The last thing he needed was to be caught up in legal red tape while a child was in danger. "She's in room 412, the first officer said finally, his voice cautious but reluctant. "But you can't just—" "I don't care what I can or can't do," Jack shot back, his voice hard. "She's in danger, and we're taking her with us." Before the officer could respond, Jack turned on his heel, heading straight for the elevator. The bikers followed him, the heavy clinking of their boots on the polished floors echoing through the hospital lobby. The little girl stayed close behind Jack, her small hand gripping his jacket tightly as they moved. When they reached the 4th floor, the tension in the air thickened. Jack could feel it. The staff was on edge. People were moving quickly, some avoiding eye contact, others whispering behind their hands. Jack's instincts told him this wasn't just a medical emergency. Something more was going on here, something far darker. The moment the elevator doors opened, Jack saw her. Maya Jenkins, lying unconscious in a hospital bed, bruises and cuts covering her face, her arm in a cast. She was surrounded by medical equipment, but Jack didn't need to see any more. His eyes locked onto the officer standing near the door. "You said she's stable?" Jack asked, his voice cold. The officer nodded, though his eyes remained wary. "We're waiting for—" Jack didn't let him finish. "Maya needs to come with us. Now." As Jack moved toward the bed, the door opened suddenly, and a man in a suit stepped inside. His cold eyes scanned the room, his posture stiff and professional. He was a cop, no doubt about it. The same cop the girl had warned him about. Officer Patrick Donovan. Jack knew exactly who he was. The tension in the room exploded as the two men locked eyes. Jack stepped between the officer and Maya's bed, his muscles tense, ready for a fight. This wasn't just about protecting Maya anymore. This was a fight for her life. I stood between Officer Patrick Donovan and Maya Jenkins, my eyes locked on his. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like it could snap at any moment. Donovan, his face rigid with authority, took a step forward, his eyes never leaving mine. He was a cop, and he wasn't going to let this go easily. "You're not taking her," he said, his voice cold and commanding. "This girl's under my protection." I could feel the anger bubbling inside me, but I kept it in check. I couldn't let him see how much his words affected me. "She's not safe with you," I replied firmly, my voice steady. "She's not safe with anyone who would hurt her." Donovan's jaw clenched, but he didn't move. His gaze flickered over to the other bikers who had gathered in the doorway, their presence solid and unyielding. They weren't leaving, and they weren't backing down. I could tell he was weighing his options, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out which direction he'd go. I turned to the nurse standing at Maya's bedside. She had been watching the exchange with wide eyes, clearly unsure of how to proceed. "You need to keep her here," she said softly, her voice shaking, "until the police can sort this out." But I didn't have time to wait for that. I wasn't going to let this man take her back to whatever hell she'd come from. I had made a promise, and I wasn't about to break it now. I stepped toward the bed, my hand resting on the edge. Maya's face was pale, her breathing shallow. She looked so fragile, so broken. But the look in her eyes, even in her unconscious state, told me everything I needed to know. She was terrified, and she had no one but us to protect her. "We're not going anywhere until she's safe," I said, my voice carrying the weight of my words. Donovan's eyes narrowed. "This is a mistake. You're making this worse for her. You have no idea what you're dealing with." I didn't let his words faze me. I had been through hell and back, and I wasn't afraid of a man who thought he could control everything. I was ready for whatever came next. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, and suddenly, 2 more officers appeared. They stood behind Donovan, their arms crossed, their eyes scanning the room. They didn't look like they were here to help. "You need to leave," one of the new officers said, his voice cold. "Now." I took a deep breath and stepped closer to Maya. I wasn't going anywhere. "This girl is coming with us," I said, my voice firm. "She's not going back to him." Donovan's eyes flickered with something. Maybe surprise, maybe anger, but he didn't back down. "You don't know what you're up against," he warned, his voice low. "I can make your lives hell." "You're already doing that," I shot back. The room was silent for a moment, and then, like a wave crashing against a shore, the tension broke. Donovan's hand went to his radio, but before he could speak, the door burst open, and another figure entered the room. The man was tall, wearing a suit, his face tight with worry. He was clearly out of place in the hospital, and his presence only added to the growing unease. "What's going on here?" the man asked, his eyes shifting between Donovan and me. Donovan turned to him, his face momentarily losing its icy composure. "This doesn't concern you," he said, his voice sharp. "I'm handling it." But the man wasn't backing down. He stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Maya's prone form in the bed. "She's my daughter," he said quietly, his voice hoarse with emotion. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't expected that. Maya's father? No, it couldn't be. Donovan had claimed to be her stepfather, but this man was something else. The truth was unfolding in real time, and I couldn't let it sink in just yet. The room seemed to grow smaller as the pieces clicked together. Maya's father had shown up, and he wasn't about to let her go either. "Maya's mine," the man continued, his voice steady but filled with a raw intensity. "And I'll be taking her home now." I glanced at the other bikers, my heart racing. This was it. The final showdown. Maya's father had just entered the equation, and we didn't know what his intentions were. Was he really here to protect her, or was this just another part of the cycle of abuse? I didn't trust him, and I didn't care what he said. Maya needed protection, and we weren't going to back down now. "You're not taking her anywhere," I said, my voice unwavering. The tension was palpable, and I could feel the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders. This was no longer about a single man or a single situation. This was about protecting a child from a system that had failed her. The room was at a standstill, the air thick with uncertainty. But one thing was clear, we weren't leaving without Maya. I looked at the bikers, each of them nodding in silent agreement. We were ready for whatever came next. The tension in the room was unbearable. Maya's father stood there, his eyes hard and unyielding, while Jack, his fists clenched, stared back at him. The other bikers were silent, each one watching, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. The hospital had become a battleground, not just for a little girl's future, but for her life. The air was thick with unspoken words, and it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Jack's voice broke the silence. "She's not going with you. You don't get to decide what happens to her anymore," he said, his tone steady but filled with authority. The man's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, he seemed to consider Jack's words. But then he spoke, his voice cold, almost detached. "You think you know what's best for her? You don't know the first thing about our life." Jack stepped closer, his boots clicking against the sterile floor with each stride. "You're right. I don't know your life. But what I do know is this. Maya is terrified of you. And no child should have to live in fear of the person who's supposed to protect them." The man's face twisted with anger, but he didn't move. His hand rested on his belt, and Jack could see the tension in his body, like he was ready to strike at any moment. The bikers around Jack shifted slightly, a silent show of solidarity, but they stayed calm, their eyes locked on Maya's father. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Maya's father spat. "I'll make sure you regret this." But Jack didn't flinch. "No, you'll regret what you did to her, and we're not going anywhere until she's safe." At that moment, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. 2 more officers appeared, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. They walked into the room, their presence adding to the mounting tension. "Is there a problem here?" one of the officers asked, his gaze moving from Maya's father to Jack. "We're just trying to get this girl the help she needs," Jack said, his voice firm. "She's not safe with him." The officers exchanged a look, clearly unsure of what to do. Maya's father stepped forward, his posture brimming with authority. "This is my daughter," he said, his voice low and commanding. "You don't know the full story. I'm the one who's been protecting her." Jack could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He knew that Maya's father was trying to play the victim here, but he wasn't buying it. "You've been protecting her?" Jack asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You're the one who hurt her. You've been hiding behind a badge, but that doesn't make you any less of a monster." Maya's father's face reddened with fury. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he growled, his hands clenching into fists. Jack didn't back down. "I know enough. Maya told us everything, and we're not going to let you hurt her anymore." The officer who had been quiet up until now finally spoke. "We're going to need to take a statement from everyone here," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But we can't do that until we get the situation under control." Jack nodded, his mind racing. He knew the wheels of justice were turning, but he wasn't going to leave Maya's side. Not now. Not when she needed him most. "We'll stay here until she's safe," Jack said, his eyes never leaving Maya's father. Maya's father opened his mouth to argue, but the officer interrupted him. "Sir, I suggest you step aside. We need to make sure this girl is protected." The officer's words were final, and Maya's father had no choice but to step back. Jack glanced at the other bikers, their expressions unreadable but supportive. Maya's father was outnumbered, and he knew it. The officers began taking statements from everyone in the room, but Jack kept his eyes on Maya. She was still unconscious, her body bruised and battered, but Jack could see the faintest sign of peace on her face. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. After what felt like an eternity, the officers finished their questioning. "We're going to need to place this girl in protective custody," one of the officers said, his voice serious. "But we'll need to get her medical attention first. She's in no condition to be moved right now." Jack nodded, his jaw tightening. "Just make sure she's safe. That's all we care about." As the officers prepared to transport Maya to a secure facility, Jack and the bikers stood by, watching silently. The little girl who had come to them for help was finally going to be safe. It wasn't over yet. There was still the matter of her father, and the truth that needed to come to light. But for now, Jack allowed himself a moment of relief. They had protected her, and that's what mattered. The sound of the hospital doors closing behind them echoed in the sterile hallway. Jack stood still for a moment, his heart pounding as the weight of the situation settled in. Maya was finally in the care of the authorities, but the road ahead was far from over. The bikers stood around him, their faces grim. This wasn't a victory. It was just the beginning. Jack ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts racing. Maya's father had been taken into custody, but that didn't mean the threat was over. There were still people out there who had been complicit in her abuse, and the truth needed to come out. "We're not done yet," Jack muttered under his breath. The other bikers nodded, sensing the unspoken understanding between them. They had made a promise to Maya, and they weren't going to let it go until she was truly safe. "What now?" Diesel asked, his voice heavy with concern. Jack took a deep breath, his mind flashing back to the moment when he first laid eyes on Maya. She was just a little girl, alone in a world that had failed her. She deserved better, and he wasn't about to walk away. "We find out everything we can about her father," Jack said, his voice steady. "We dig deep, and we make sure he never gets near her again." The group stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their mission settling over them. This wasn't just about protecting Maya from one man. It was about dismantling the system that allowed people like him to thrive. "I'll start making calls," Vince said, stepping forward. "I've got some contacts who can dig into his background. If he's been involved in anything illegal, we'll find it." "Good," Jack replied, giving him a nod of approval. "We'll need everything. If he's connected to anyone, we'll follow the trail." As Vince stepped away to make his calls, Jack turned to the rest of the crew. "We need to make sure Maya's safe. I'll stay here with her until we know she's settled." The other bikers nodded, understanding the unspoken bond that had been formed. Maya had come to them for help, and they weren't about to let her down now. As the hours passed, Jack stayed at the hospital, keeping a close watch on Maya. The doctors came and went, working to stabilize her, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He knew that this wasn't over. Maya's father wasn't the only person in her life who had failed her. There was more to her story, and they were going to uncover it all. When the sun finally began to rise, Jack stood up, his back stiff from hours of waiting. The little girl who had come to them for help was finally asleep, her face peaceful for the first time in what seemed like forever. Jack felt a glimmer of hope, but it was quickly extinguished when Vince returned with news. I dug into his background. Vince said, his voice low. There's more here than we thought. Maya's father has been involved in some shady dealings. He's connected to a few people who run illegal businesses. We've got to dig deeper. Jack's eyes hardened. I knew it, he muttered, his fists clenching. We'll keep going until we expose everything. We can't let him get away with this. With a newfound sense of determination, Jack gathered the bikers together. We're not stopping until we take down everyone involved. Maya deserves better, and we're going to make sure she gets it. The bikers nodded in agreement, their faces resolute. They had taken on this mission to protect Maya, and now they were going to take down the entire network that had allowed her to be hurt. Let's get to work, Jack said, his voice filled with purpose. The crew got to work immediately, each biker using their unique skills and connections to dig into Maya's father's past. They were relentless, poring over every detail, tracking down every lead. As they dug deeper, the picture of Maya's life before she came to them began to take shape. It wasn't just her father who had been the problem. There were others, people who had turned a blind eye, people who had enabled his behavior. And Jack was determined to bring them all to justice. Hours turned into days, and the bikers continued their investigation. They worked together like a well-oiled machine, following the trail wherever it led. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they had the information they needed. Maya's father wasn't just involved in illegal businesses. He was part of a larger criminal network, one that had been operating for years, preying on vulnerable people. Jack's blood boiled as he read through the details. This wasn't just about a man who had hurt his daughter. This was about a system of abuse that stretched far beyond him. This ends now, Jack said, his voice filled with fury. The bikers were ready. They were going to take down the entire network, no matter what it took. Jack knew this wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that they had one thing the criminals didn't, loyalty. And that was the one thing that would make all the difference. Maya had come to them for help, and they weren't going to stop until they had brought everyone responsible to justice. They weren't just fighting for her. They were fighting for everyone who had ever been hurt by people like him. The sun had barely risen, casting a dim light over the city as Jack and the bikers gathered outside the small diner where they had set up base. The plan was coming together, but Jack could feel the weight of what lay ahead. They had uncovered a network of criminals, and now they were about to bring it all down. It wasn't just about protecting Maya anymore. It was about taking down the system that allowed people like her father to thrive. Jack took a deep breath, his hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the last few days. He had promised Maya he would keep her safe, and he wasn't going to stop until that promise was fulfilled. We've got the information we need, Jack said, addressing the crew as they gathered around him. Diesel, the massive biker with a weathered face, was the first to speak. We've tracked down a few of the key players in this operation. We know where they meet, who they're working with, but we still need to hit them hard. Jack nodded. We're not going in half-hearted. We hit them all at once, take down their entire operation. No one gets away. The bikers around him exchanged looks, all of them nodding in agreement. They had been through worse, and this wasn't about to scare them off. I've got eyes on the warehouse, Vince, the club's medic, said. That's where they're storing most of their illegal goods. We can cut off their supply and take their leadership down all in one move. Perfect, Jack said. We'll need to move quickly. This isn't going to be easy, and there's no room for error. We get in, we get out, and we make sure Maya stays safe. The group spent the next few hours finalizing the plan, using every resource at their disposal. The bikers who had connections with local law enforcement were making calls, ensuring that the right authorities would be on standby once they struck. Diesel, with his imposing size, would take point, leading the charge into the warehouse, while the rest of the crew would flank the building, securing all exits. Jack would oversee the operation from the ground, ensuring that no one was left behind. We do this together, Jack reminded the crew as they suited up in their leather jackets, the weight of the mission settling on their shoulders. The group mounted their bikes, their engines roaring to life as they hit the streets, heading toward the warehouse. The plan was set in motion. The city's streets were eerily quiet as they rode through the early morning hours, their headlights cutting through the misty air. Jack's mind raced as they neared their destination. He could almost feel the tension in the air, the weight of what they were about to do. This wasn't just about taking down criminals. This was about making sure that nothing like what happened to Maya would ever happen again. As they approached the warehouse, Jack signaled for everyone to halt. The building loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. It was clear that no one inside had any intention of letting them in peacefully. "This is it," Jack said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "Stay sharp. We move in quick and quiet. No unnecessary risks." The bikers nodded, their faces hardening as they prepared to strike. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he gave the signal to move. They rode forward, their bikes cutting through the night like a wave of steel and leather. The sound of their engines grew louder as they neared the entrance of the warehouse. Just as they reached the gates, the sound of gunfire echoed in the distance. Someone inside the warehouse had spotted them. "Move!" Jack shouted. The bikers rushed forward, storming the gates with incredible speed. The first shots rang out, but the bikers were prepared. Diesel, the first to breach the perimeter, charged forward with his massive frame, knocking down anyone who got in his way. Jack followed closely behind, moving swiftly through the shadows, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. The sound of more gunfire rang through the air, but it wasn't enough to stop them. They were outnumbered, but they had the element of surprise. Jack and the bikers moved quickly, taking out anyone who stood in their path. They worked as one unit, methodical and relentless. The sound of the battle echoed through the warehouse as the bikers pressed forward, determined to reach the heart of the operation. Jack's eyes flicked around, making sure everyone was accounted for. His mind was sharp, focused solely on the task at hand. They couldn't afford to fail. The deeper they got into the warehouse, the more desperate the criminals became. They fought back fiercely, but the bikers were trained for this kind of battle. They moved with precision, clearing rooms one by one, taking down anyone who posed a threat. Finally, Jack reached the inner sanctum of the warehouse, where the operations leaders were hiding. It was here that everything would be decided. He kicked down the door, his boots echoing through the room. The criminals inside didn't expect him to be so quick, and they were caught off guard. Jack's eyes met theirs, filled with cold determination. "It's over," Jack said, his voice low but powerful. The criminals tried to make a run for it, but it was too late. The bikers had them surrounded. The mission was a success. The warehouse was secured, and Maya's abusers were taken into custody. But Jack knew that this was only one victory in a long battle. The fight for justice wasn't over yet, but it had taken a significant step forward. As the bikers stood over the criminals they had just apprehended, Jack looked over at Maya, who was safe, her face filled with hope. This was what they had fought for. This was what they had risked everything to protect. And as they loaded the criminals into the back of the police cars, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had kept their promise to Maya. They had protected her. The warehouse was a mess. The sounds of sirens echoed in the distance as the bikers stood around, catching their breath after the chaos. Jack looked around at his crew, each one of them exhausted but relieved. They had done it. They had taken down the operation, freed Maya, and made sure the criminals responsible for her suffering were behind bars. The battle wasn't over, but tonight was a victory. Jack approached the back of one of the police cars where Maya was sitting. She looked up at him, her eyes still filled with the fear of what she had been through, but there was something different now, a glimmer of hope in her gaze. It was a sight that made all the risks worth it. "How are you holding up?" Jack asked gently, kneeling beside her. Maya didn't respond at first, just looked down at her hands in her lap. But after a few moments, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared," she said, her eyes flickering up to meet his. "I thought they were going to take me back. I thought they were going to hurt me again." Jack's heart broke for her, but he knew this was far from over. "You're safe now, Maya," he said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're with us, and we're not letting anyone hurt you again. Do you hear me?" Maya nodded slowly, but her small face was still clouded with uncertainty. Jack stood up and motioned for the crew to gather around. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "We've got the leaders, but there's still more to do. We need to make sure this operation is fully dismantled." Diesel, the biggest of the bikers, grunted in agreement. "We've got their names, their connections. We'll finish what we started." Vince, the club's medic, stepped forward, his eyes scanning the crowd. "And we need to make sure Maya's taken care of. She's been through a lot. We'll make sure she gets the help she needs. Jack nodded, grateful for the team around him. They weren't just bikers. They were family. Maya, you stay here with Vince, Jack said gently, his eyes softening as he looked at the young girl. He's going to make sure you're okay. We'll take care of everything else. Maya looked up at him, her eyes still a little fearful, but trusting him more than before. Thank you, she whispered. Jack smiled and turned away, walking toward the rest of the crew. Let's move out. We've got work to do. The group mounted their bikes, ready to finish what they had started. They roared to life, the sound of the engines filling the night air as they headed out to deal with the remnants of the operation. The ride was long, and the tension in the air was palpable. But Jack knew that every mile they rode, every move they made, was bringing them closer to the end of this fight. They weren't just taking down a few criminals. They were fighting a system of corruption, a network that had been hurting people for far too long. It wasn't going to be easy, and Jack knew there would be more obstacles along the way, but he also knew they couldn't stop now. They wouldn't. As they neared the final destination, a rundown building on the outskirts of the city, Jack's mind raced. He could already hear the faint hum of voices and the sound of shuffling footsteps. This was it, the last stronghold. Jack gave the signal, and the crew immediately went into action. Diesel led the charge, his large figure storming toward the door while the others took up their positions. Jack moved with the group, adrenaline pumping through his veins. They'd been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for justice. This was a fight for a future where people like Maya didn't have to live in fear. As they breached the door and stormed inside, the criminals inside didn't know what hit them. The bikers moved with the precision of a well-trained unit, each one knowing exactly what to do. They took out anyone who posed a threat and secured the building, their mission clear. Jack kept his focus, making sure that no one got away. This was the final blow to a criminal network that had been operating for far too long. As the last of the criminals were taken into custody, Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had done it. They had brought them down. But as Jack stood in the middle of the room, looking around at the faces of his crew, he knew this wasn't over. Maya was safe for now, but there were still more fights to be fought, more people to protect. But for tonight, they had won. As they left the building, the sound of their bikes filling the air once more, Jack felt the weight of the past few days settle into his bones. It had been a hard fight, but it was worth it. They had protected Maya, and they had taken down a criminal empire. And that was just the beginning. The sun had already set, casting an orange glow over the city as Jack and the crew rode back to the small diner where they had initially gathered. The day had been long, filled with intense action, and as much as they had accomplished, the fight wasn't over. Jack's mind kept drifting back to Maya. She had been through so much, but now, thanks to them, she was safe. As they parked their bikes in the diner's lot, the rest of the crew dismounted, each one weary but resolute. Jack felt the weight of the situation on his shoulders, but there was a sense of satisfaction in knowing they had done something good. We hit them hard today, Diesel said as he walked over to Jack, wiping sweat from his brow. They didn't see us coming. They won't be back for a long time. Jack nodded, but his mind was still racing. It's not over yet. We've only scratched the surface. The rest of the crew gathered around, their faces solemn. They knew what Jack meant. Taking down one criminal operation wasn't enough. They had uncovered a bigger problem, one that stretched far beyond what they had initially expected. Maya's father isn't the only one. There are others out there like him, hiding behind badges and power, Jack continued. We've exposed them, but we have to make sure it doesn't happen again. Vince, the club's medic, stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. We've done a lot of damage today, but Maya's going to need time to heal. She's been through a lot, and we need to make sure she's taken care of. Jack's face softened at the mention of Maya. She's strong, but we can't let her do this alone. He paused for a moment, then added, we need to make sure she has a future, a safe one. That means we get everything on these guys, expose every last one of them. Diesel gave a low grunt of agreement. We'll find everything. We won't let them slip away. We'll keep going until they're all behind bars, Jack said, his voice firm, full of determination. But we need to be smart about this. We can't rush in without knowing the full scope. The crew nodded in unison, understanding the gravity of the situation. We'll make calls, get more intel, and hit them where it hurts, Diesel said. They won't know what hit them. Exactly, Jack replied. We've come too far to back down now. The bikers spent the next few days gathering information, digging deeper into the network they had just started to dismantle. Every lead was followed, every connection explored. Jack and the crew worked tirelessly, knowing that they had to act quickly before the criminals had a chance to regroup. Meanwhile, Maya was resting at a safe house, surrounded by the bikers who had promised to protect her. The house was secure, and though she was still frightened, there was a sense of peace in knowing that no one was going to hurt her anymore. Jack visited her whenever he could, offering her comfort and reassurance. He could see that, despite everything, Maya was beginning to trust again. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack sat with Maya in the quiet of the house. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude, but also with uncertainty. I don't know what happens now, Maya said softly. Jack gave her a reassuring smile. You'll be okay. We'll make sure of it. No one will hurt you again. Maya nodded, but Jack could see the worry still in her eyes. It's not just about you, Jack continued. There are others out there who need our help, and we're going to make sure they're safe too. Maya looked down, her hands trembling slightly. I'm scared, she whispered. I don't want to go back to that life. Jack leaned forward, placing a hand on hers. You won't have to. We won't let you. He paused, his voice softening. You're part of our family now, and we protect our family. Maya looked up at him, her face slowly softening. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know what I would have done without you. Jack smiled, a rare softness in his expression. You don't have to worry about that. We're here for you always. As Jack left the house that night, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. Maya was safe, but the battle was far from over. There were still people out there, still dangerous criminals who needed to be brought to justice. He knew that the crew had more work to do, but for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different for Maya. They had fought for her, and they would continue to fight until every last person responsible for her suffering was behind bars. The mission wasn't just about justice. It was about redemption, and Jack wasn't about to let anyone slip through the cracks. Not now. Not ever. The days following their successful takedown of the criminal network were tense, but also filled with a sense of purpose. Jack and the crew had dismantled the operation, but Jack knew it wasn't over. The criminals might be behind bars, but the damage they caused wasn't easily undone. Maya had been moved to a safe house, and though she was beginning to heal, her journey was far from over. Jack visited her often, spending time with her and making sure she knew she was protected. He couldn't help but notice the small changes in her, the way she started smiling more, the way she seemed less afraid when she looked around. But deep down, Jack knew that her recovery wasn't just about keeping her safe physically. It was about restoring her faith in the world. That would take time. As the weeks passed, the crew continued to gather intel on the remaining members of the network. They'd uncovered connections to local politicians and business leaders, people who had turned a blind eye to the suffering for far too long. Jack knew that if they wanted to end this for good, they would have to take down every single one of them, no matter how powerful or influential they were. We've hit them once, but it's not enough, Jack said to the crew one night, his voice low and steady. We need to take down the people pulling the strings, the ones who thought they were untouchable. Diesel, as always, was the first to agree. We go in. We take them all down. No mercy. Jack nodded. No mercy. But we need to be smart. We don't take risks now. We've made it this far. We finish what we started. The crew worked tirelessly, using every contact, every connection they had to get closer to the final members of the network. They followed leads, uncovered secrets, and slowly, piece by piece, the full extent of the operation was revealed. Jack wasn't surprised by what they found. Corruption ran deep in this city. It was everywhere, in places Jack hadn't even thought to look. But no matter how powerful the people involved were, Jack wasn't going to stop. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about making sure no one else had to suffer like Maya had. One evening, as Jack sat in the diner with the crew, his phone buzzed. It was Vince, the club's medic, who had been working the hardest on getting all the information. Jack picked up the phone, his eyes narrowing as he listened. We've got them, Vince said, his voice calm but urgent. The last of the leaders. They're meeting tonight at the old docks. We can take them all down in one go. Jack stood up, a wave of determination washing over him. We do it tonight. No more waiting. We end this now. The crew quickly made their preparations, each biker grabbing their gear and mounting their bikes. The sound of engines revving filled the air as they sped off toward the docks, ready for the final confrontation. The docks were quiet when they arrived, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore the only noise breaking the silence. Jack led the group toward the building where the criminals were meeting. It was a rundown warehouse, abandoned for years, but still the perfect place for a secret meeting. "This is it," Jack said quietly, motioning for everyone to spread out. "We hit them hard, we hit them fast." No hesitation. The bikers moved into position, their bodies tense with anticipation. They had done this countless times before, but tonight felt different. Tonight, they were taking down the last of the people who had caused so much pain and suffering. Jack's heart raced as he glanced at the building. He could already see shadows moving inside. The leaders were here, and they had no idea what was coming. "On. My signal," Jack said, his voice low. "We move." The signal came, and the bikers surged forward, storming the building with the precision of a well-oiled machine. They breached the doors, catching the criminals completely off guard. The room erupted into chaos as Jack and his crew took control. The fight was fierce, but they were prepared. The bikers moved with swift determination, subduing the criminals one by one. The leaders of the operation were quickly overwhelmed, their plans unraveling before their eyes. Jack found himself face to face with the final leader, a man who had been the mastermind behind the entire operation. The man tried to flee, but Jack wasn't about to let him get away. With a single motion, Jack grabbed him by the arm, pulling him back into the room. "It's over," Jack said, his voice cold. "You're done." The man sneered, but Jack could see the fear in his eyes. "You think you've won?" the man spat. "There's always someone else. You'll never get rid of us." Jack didn't flinch. "We're getting rid of you. And anyone else who tries to hurt people like Maya." The man's expression twisted with anger as he was taken into custody, the remaining criminals following suit. The mission had been a success. The operation had been completely dismantled. As the police arrived to take the criminals away, Jack stood outside, looking at the night sky. The city was quiet now, but Jack knew it was a quiet that would last. Maya would be safe. The crew had kept their promise. The fight wasn't over. There were always battles to be fought. But for tonight, Jack allowed himself a moment of peace. They had won. The streets were quieter now, the chaos of the past few weeks slowly fading into a distant memory. Jack sat at the diner, his coffee barely touched, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just transpired. The final takedown of the criminal network had been a success, but the sense of victory was muted by the realization that the work was far from done. There was always another fight to fight, another injustice to face. The bikers had done their part, but the city had a long way to go before it was truly free of the darkness that had plagued it for so long. As Jack stared out the window, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Vince. "We've got to talk." Jack's gut tightened. Vince wasn't one to send cryptic messages unless something was wrong. He stood up, tossing a few bills on the table, and walked out the door. The cool night air hit him as he stepped outside, the sound of his boots echoing on the pavement. He walked to his bike, fired it up, and rode out to meet Vince at the safe house. When Jack arrived, Vince was waiting for him by the door. His expression was serious, even more so than usual. "What's going on?" Jack asked as he dismounted. Vince glanced around before speaking. "I've been digging into the background of the operation we shut down. There's something you need to know." Jack's heart raced. "What did you find?" Vince hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "It's bigger than we thought. Much bigger. There are still people out there, people who weren't part of the network, but they're connected to it. They're in positions of power. They're untouchable." Jack's jaw tightened. He'd suspected as much. The deeper they dug, the more it seemed like the corruption ran through the very veins of the city. "We can't stop now," Jack said, his voice low and firm. "We've got to keep going. We can't let these people continue to operate in the shadows." Vince nodded. "I know, but it's not just about taking down criminals anymore. It's about exposing the system. We need to shine a light on the people who've been pulling the strings, the ones who have been getting away with it for years." Jack felt the weight of the words. It wasn't just about protecting Maya anymore. It was about taking down the system that allowed people like her father to thrive. "What do we do next?" Jack asked. Vince stepped closer, his voice low. "We need to get the right people in the right positions. We've got to find the ones who've been enabling these criminals, the ones who thought they were safe from the law. We've got to make sure they can't hide anymore. Jack's eyes darkened. You're right. This isn't just about us. This is about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. We can't let these people think they've won. The two of them stood there for a moment, the weight of their mission settling in. Jack knew it wasn't going to be easy. The fight ahead would be harder than anything they'd faced before, but he also knew they couldn't back down now. They had come too far. We'll need more help, Jack said finally, his voice resolute. We'll need to reach out to people who have the power to make a real change. We can't do this alone. Vince nodded in agreement. I've already started making calls. We'll need to be careful. These people are dangerous, and they have eyes everywhere. But we can't let fear stop us. Jack's determination flared. We've already taken down one operation. We can take down the rest. We've got to do it for Maya. For everyone else who's been hurt. Vince placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. We're with you. All the way. Jack nodded, his mind already working on the next steps. He knew this was going to be a long fight, but he wasn't about to give up now. Maya had trusted them to protect her, and they weren't going to fail her. Let's get to work, Jack said, his voice steady with resolve. The crew gathered once more, each member prepared for the long road ahead. They would fight until the very end, until the last of the people responsible for the suffering in their city were held accountable. It wasn't just about making sure criminals paid for their actions. It was about breaking the system that allowed them to exist in the first place. The mission was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Jack felt like they were on the right path. They were going to expose the truth. They were going to bring real change. And this time, they weren't going to stop until they had taken down every last person who had ever abused their power. This was just the beginning. The crew gathered at the safe house, the dim light of early morning creeping through the blinds as Jack addressed the group. The atmosphere was tense but focused. Everyone knew that the battle they had just won was only a small part of the war they were about to wage. Maya was resting upstairs, safe for now, but Jack's mind was far from at ease. He had promised to protect her, but the threat was far from gone. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind, but there was more to be done. The criminals were down, but their influence, their reach, extended deep into the heart of the city. We've made a dent, Jack began, his voice steady but urgent. But the real fight's still ahead. We've got to expose everything, every person, every connection. Diesel, ever the first to speak up, cracked his knuckles. You're right. We've taken down their enforcers, but now we need to cut off the head of the snake. The ones pulling the strings are still out there. Vince, the club's medic and unofficial strategist, nodded. We've already found some key players. Some high-profile names. But we need more intel. We need to make sure we're hitting them where it hurts. Jack's mind was sharp. We know who some of the big names are, but we don't know everything yet. We can't rush this. We've got to plan carefully. One wrong move, and we're back to square one. So, what's the next step? Asked Shadow, his voice calm but laced with the seriousness of the situation. Jack leaned forward, looking at each of them. We take everything we've learned and start hitting the people who have been covering up for them. Politicians, business owners, anyone with power who's been enabling this operation. If they think they're untouchable, they're wrong. We're going to show them that no one is above the law. The plan was set in motion. The bikers split into teams, each with a specific task. Some would continue digging into the backgrounds of the criminals. Others would begin to gather more evidence to expose the corrupt officials who had been turning a blind eye. Jack and Diesel took the lead, knowing that their biggest target would be the politicians and wealthy business owners who had been funding the operation. We'll need to be careful, Jack reminded Diesel as they suited up. These people are powerful. We need to take them down quietly, expose them without causing a scene. We can't afford to tip our hand too early. Diesel gave a nod. Don't worry, Jack. We'll get them. No one's safe now. As the teams dispersed, Jack could feel the weight of their mission on his shoulders. He had spent years fighting battles, but this was different. This wasn't just about taking down criminals. This was about dismantling a system of corruption, about taking away the power that allowed people to abuse others for their own gain. The day passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and quiet planning. They dug deeper into the network, uncovered new leads, and slowly but surely, the puzzle began to fall into place. Jack's phone buzzed late that night. Vince had found something. Jack, I've got something. We need to talk. It's big. Jack's heart skipped a beat. Where? The old courthouse, Vince replied. I think we're finally close to the core of this operation. I've found the financial records linking them to some of the highest people in the city. We can bring them down with this. Jack's pulse quickened. I'm on my way. He grabbed his jacket, heading toward his bike with Diesel at his side. They rode out into the night. The streets quiet, but the tension in the air palpable. The courthouse was just as empty as they'd left it, an imposing building standing like a monument to the corruption that had festered inside. Jack and Diesel entered the building, careful to avoid drawing attention. Vince was already waiting in the records room, the dim light casting shadows over the piles of paperwork. What have you got? Jack asked as he approached. Vince looked up, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a discovery well made. These are the financial records, Vince said, handing over a folder filled with detailed documents. I've found direct links between the operation and several city council members. It's bigger than we thought. Jack took the folder, flipping through the pages with a growing sense of urgency. Each page was a revelation, showing how deep the corruption ran, how many people were involved in keeping the operation alive. The documents revealed the flow of money, the backdoor deals, and the names of the people who had been complicit. Jack's eyes narrowed as he read. We've got them, he said, his voice low with satisfaction. This is it. We take these to the press, to the police, to anyone who will listen. We expose them all. Diesel stepped forward, his expression hardening. But we need to be careful. These people won't go down without a fight. Jack nodded, his jaw tight. I know, but we've got the evidence now. It's time for the truth to come out. The bikers made their plans, organizing the evidence and getting ready to take it to the right people. They knew that once they exposed these officials, there would be consequences, and they would have to be ready for anything. Jack looked at his crew, his family, and felt a surge of pride. They weren't just fighting for justice. They were fighting for the people who had no one else to turn to. For Maya. For everyone who had been hurt. They were taking down the corrupt system that allowed people like her father to flourish, and they were going to make sure that no one ever had to face what Maya had gone through again. The weeks that followed were filled with tension, but also with a sense of accomplishment. Jack and his crew had exposed the criminal network, dismantled it piece by piece, and brought the people responsible for the suffering of so many to justice. The corrupt officials, the enforcers, and the masterminds, they were all either behind bars or facing charges that would end their reign of terror. The city was beginning to breathe again, and for the first time in a long time, there was hope in the air. Maya, safe in the witness protection program, was on her way to recovery. She had started going to therapy, slowly opening up about her past, her fears, and her dreams. It wasn't easy, but Jack could see the difference in her. She smiled more now, her eyes less clouded with the weight of her past. Jack had kept his promise to her, but he knew that the road to healing would take time. One evening, as Jack sat on the porch of the safe house, looking out at the quiet street, Diesel walked over and sat beside him. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only noise. It's done, Diesel said, breaking the silence. The city's starting to rebuild. Jack nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the horizon. Yeah, but it's not over. Not for everyone. There are still people out there who need our help. Diesel glanced over at him, his brow furrowed. You don't think it's done? We've taken down the whole operation, Jack. The city's safer now. Jack sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. It's safer, but there's always more work to do. People like Maya are still out there. People who have no one to turn to. We can't just walk away. Diesel remained silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. You're right. We've come this far, and we're not stopping now. Jack gave him a half-smile. No, we're not stopping. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. Jack had become involved in helping clean up the system, working with law enforcement and local organizations to make sure the city stayed on the right path. There were still corrupt people in power, but they were starting to lose their influence, and for the first time in years, it felt like change was possible. Jack was approached by a local community leader one afternoon, a woman named Lisa, who had been working to rebuild neighborhoods that had been devastated by crime. She had heard about the work Jack and the bikers had done and wanted to talk about ways they could collaborate. The work you've done, it's made a real difference, Lisa said, sitting across from Jack at the diner. But there's still a lot to be done. People need help getting back on their feet, and we need to make sure that we're creating a safer environment for everyone. Jack leaned forward, his elbows on the table. I agree. There's still a lot of work to be done. We've taken down the criminals, but we have to make sure the next generation isn't caught in the same cycle. We have to help people rebuild, not just punish the bad ones. Lisa smiled, her eyes bright with determination. That's exactly what I want to do. I want to work with you and your crew. We need all hands on deck, and you guys have the reach to make it happen. Jack nodded. We're in. Whatever you need, we'll help. We'll work together to rebuild this city. As they shook hands, Jack felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. This wasn't just about fighting crime anymore. It was about building something new, something better. They had taken down the corrupt, but now it was time to lift up the people who had been left behind. The bikers didn't just protect people from the shadows anymore. They were helping them rebuild, showing them that there was hope. That night, as Jack walked back to the safe house, he thought about Maya. She was a testament to their fight, proof that even in the darkest of circumstances, change was possible. She was no longer the scared little girl who had been hiding in the shadows. She was growing stronger every day. Jack knew that the road ahead would be difficult. There would always be challenges, always more to do. But as he looked up at the stars, he realized that they had already done something incredible. They had taken a broken system and brought it down, and they were going to help rebuild it, piece by piece. For Maya, for everyone who had been hurt, and for a city that had been waiting for a chance to heal. Jack smiled as he reached the door. The work was far from done, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were on the right path. The world was changing, and they were going to make sure it stayed that way.